October 1944, a complete historical deep dive, 8,500 plus words. Opening, The Theater of Ghosts, 1,200 words, October 1944. Europe is a continent screaming under the weight of metal and fire. The Ardennes forest, a place of ancient myths and dark shadows, is chilled by the encroaching winter of 1944. The soil of Lorraine, once fertile and gold, is now churned into a bloody, viscous mire by the tracks of thousands of tanks. In this theater of death, the Allied juggernaut, spearheaded by the most controversial and charismatic figure in American military history, General George S. Patton, Jr., is battering itself against the ancient, jagged fortifications of Metz. But while Patton's Third Army struggles against the concrete and steel of the West Wall, a darker, more intimate drama is unfolding behind German lines in the quiet village of Herrlingen. This is a moment of profound transition, a hinge point in human history where the destinies of the two most aggressive commanders of the Second World War finally diverge forever. To the popular imagination, these two men, George Patton and Erwin Rommel, are the twin titans of mobile warfare. They are the masters of the blitzkrieg philosophy, men who transformed the chaotic, terrifying slaughter of the modern battlefield into a form of violent, high-speed art. We often envision them as two grand masters at a chess table, each anticipating the other's move across the vast deserts of North Africa or the hedgerows of France. In our mind's eye, we see Patton standing tall in his command jeep, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the sun, scanning the horizon for the dust clouds of the Afrika Korps. We hear the echo of the silver screen, where Patton famously shouts, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." It is a quote that has defined their relationship for decades, yet it is a quote that was never spoken in reality. The reality of October 1944 was far grimmer, more complex, and infinitely more tragic than any Hollywood script could ever hope to capture. It was a month defined by a striking, almost cruel paradox. While George Patton was fighting with every fiber of his being to break into Germany from the outside, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was being systematically destroyed by Germany from the inside. One man was at the absolute peak of his operational power, commanding a massive, industrial armored force that moved with the terrifying precision of a modern machine. The other was a broken hero, a man living in the shadow of his own legend, recovering from near-fatal wounds only to find himself in the crosshairs of the very dictator he had once served with blind loyalty. By October 1944, the war of the generals, that perceived chivalrous, tactical duel between respected adversaries, had been crushed by the cold reality of total war. The era of the great captains, leading from the front with a sense of 19th century honor, was being swallowed by the industrial-scale slaughter of the 20th century. In the mud of Lorraine and the silence of a German country house, the legacies of Patton and Rommel were being forged into their final, permanent forms. One would go on to lead the final, desperate charge into the heart of the Third Reich, becoming the face of American victory. The other would be forced to bite into a cyanide capsule, a sacrificial lamb offered up to appease a paranoid regime that had turned on its greatest soldier. To truly understand this month, we must look past the propaganda and the movies. We must look at the specific dates. October 14th, 1944, in particular, a day that serves as a tombstone for one man and a milestone for the other. We must examine the tactical maps of the Third Army and the secret transcripts of the Gestapo. We must ask, why did Patton admire a man who fought for a regime he loathed? And why did Hitler, at the height of a desperate war, choose to kill the only general the Allies truly feared? The context of October 1944 is not just a dry record of troop movements, fuel shortages, or unit designations like the 4th Armored Division or the 5th Infantry Division. It is the story of two warriors who, despite never meeting face to face in the heat of battle, shared a professional DNA that defined an entire era of combat. They were both men of action trapped in an age of growing bureaucracy. They both believed that speed was the ultimate armor, that the boldest plan was almost always the safest, and that a commander's place was where the bullets were flying, not in a bunker miles behind the lines. As the winter of 1944 approached, the fog of war was thicker than ever. Patton was blinded by his own ambition and the logistical failures of his superiors, while Rommel was blinded by the betrayal of his leader. This month represents the final divergence of their paths. One path led to the crossing of the Rhine and the halls of Valhalla. The other led to a state funeral built on a foundation of lies. The weather itself seemed to conspire against both men. In Lorraine, the autumn rains had turned the battlefield into a primordial swamp. American Sherman tanks, already outgunned by German Panthers and Tigers, now found themselves literally drowning in French mud. Patton's famous mobility was negated created by nature itself. Meanwhile, in Herlingen, a cold fog descended on the village, the kind of fog that muffles sound and makes every shadow suspicious. It was the perfect weather for an assassination disguised as a medical emergency. This is the deep dive into the myth, the reality, and the tragic conclusion of the most famous rivalry that never actually happened on a single battlefield. It is the story of two men who were, in many ways, the last of their kind, warriors who lived for the fight, but were ultimately defined by how they faced the end. To understand October 1944, we must first travel back to the origins of the legend. The strategic situation of late 1944 was not born in a vacuum. It was the result of a violent evolution that began in the dust of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy. By the time the autumn leaves began to fall, the Third Reich was a wounded animal, cornered and lashing out, while the Allied forces were grappling with the sheer scale of their own success. At the heart of this titanic struggle stood two men whose names had become synonymous with victory: George S. Patton Jr. and Erwin Rommel. For George Patton, the road to October 1944 had been one of redemption and relentless aggression. After the slapping incidents in Sicily, where he struck two soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, calling them cowards, Patton had nearly lost everything. Eisenhower, his friend and superior, had been forced to sideline him. While other generals led the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, Patton sat in England, commanding a phantom army designed to deceive the Germans about where the invasion would land. This punishment ate at his soul. Patton was a man who believed in destiny, reincarnation, and his own divine purpose. He wrote poetry about his past lives as a Roman legionnaire, a knight at Crecy, a soldier under Napoleon. To be kept from battle was, to him, a form of spiritual death. But when he was finally unleashed with his Third Army during Operation Cobra in late July 1944, he performed what many considered a military miracle. The breakout from Normandy had been brutal and slow. Weeks of fighting in the claustrophobic hedgerows, where every field was a fortress and every lane a killing ground. But once Patton's tanks broke through at Avranches, they didn't stop. He turned the static war of the hedgerows into a race of mechanized thunder that left German commanders reeling. His philosophy was elegantly simple: keep on advancing. Whether we go over the top or through the middle or around the ends, we must never stop. By September, he had liberated vast swaths of France, covering distances that seemed impossible. His Third Army advanced so quickly that German units often surrendered simply because they couldn't believe Americans had already reached their positions. Towns that expected to see Germans for weeks more suddenly found American tanks rolling down their streets. Patton's style was pure aggression. He believed that speed itself was a weapon, that a moving army was harder to hit than a stationary one, and that the enemy should never be given time to breathe, think, or organize. Yet success bred its own problems. As Patton approached the German border, the famous Great Gasoline Crisis struck with devastating effect. The Allied supply lines, still running all the way back to the Normandy beaches, were stretched impossibly thin. Every gallon of fuel had to be trucked hundreds of miles over damaged roads and blown bridges. The trucks of the Red Ball Express, largely driven by African-American soldiers who kept the army moving, ran day and night in a heroic effort. But it wasn't enough. The army was literally outrunning its supply lines. The Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced an impossible choice: fuel Montgomery's ambitious Market Garden operation in the north, which promised a quick thrust into Germany's industrial heart, or fuel Patton's drive toward the Saar, which offered a more direct route to the Rhine. Eisenhower chose Montgomery, partly for strategic reasons and partly for political ones. The British needed a victory to maintain their prestige within the alliance. For the first time in months, Patton was forced to slow down, then stop entirely. His tanks sat idle, their fuel gauges on empty, while Patton raged against what he saw as political maneuvering and timidity. This stagnation in October 1944 was, for Patton, torture. He was a man who believed in the relentless pursuit, and being halted at the gates of Metz, an ancient fortress city that had never been taken by direct assault in its entire 1,000-year history, was an insult to his destiny. He would pace his headquarters like a caged lion, cursing everyone from Eisenhower to Montgomery to the weather gods. In his diary, he wrote bitter entries about how the war could be won by Christmas if only they would turn me loose. He genuinely believed that his moment was slipping away, that history was passing him by. On the other side of the wire, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was facing a crisis of a different, more lethal nature. Once the poster boy of the Nazi regime, the hero of France 1940 and the legendary Desert Fox of the Afrika Korps, Rommel's relationship with Hitler had deteriorated into mutual suspicion and barely concealed contempt. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable, and by October 1944, it had become a death sentence. Rommel's doubts began in North Africa, where he saw firsthand the industrial might of the Americans and British. At El Alamein in late 1942, Montgomery's British Eighth Army had defeated him not through tactical brilliance. Rommel still believed he was the better tactician, but through sheer material superiority. For every tank Rommel lost, the British had 3 to replace it. For every gallon of fuel that trickled to the Afrika Korps through the Mediterranean gauntlet, the British had hundreds. Rommel, who had built his reputation on doing more with less, on turning weakness into strength through speed and surprise, finally encountered a situation where less was simply not enough. No amount of tactical genius could overcome the mathematics of industrial warfare. His doubts deepened when he was given command of the Atlantic Wall defenses in late 1943. Hitler and the High Command spoke grandly of Fortress Europe, an impregnable wall of concrete and steel stretching from Norway to Spain. But Rommel saw the reality. Not enough men, not enough concrete, not enough mines, not enough guns, not enough of anything except desperate hope and propaganda. He traveled the length of the French coast, from Brittany to Pas de Calais, and everywhere he saw weakness. He tried to improve the defenses, installing millions of mines and beach obstacles, but he knew in his heart it wouldn't be enough. In letters to his wife Lucy, he began expressing thoughts that, had they been intercepted by the Gestapo, would have signed his death warrant years earlier. He spoke of the war being lost, of the need for political solutions, of his growing horror at what the Nazi regime was doing to Germany and to Europe. The critical moment for Rommel came on July 17, 1944, 11 days after D-Day. While driving near the village of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery in Normandy, his staff car was strafed by Royal Air Force Spitfires. The pilots, hunting for targets of opportunity, didn't know they had found the legendary Desert Fox. Cannon fire ripped through the car. The driver was killed instantly. The car swerved wildly and crashed into a tree. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle, suffering multiple skull fractures, a broken cheekbone, and severe facial injuries. He was unconscious for days, bleeding from his ears and mouth. The man who had commanded the Afrika Korps from the turret of a tank, who had led from the front at every battle, was now fighting for his life in a French hospital bed. He was out of the fight, physically broken at the very moment his country needed him most. But while he lay recovering, a darker conspiracy was coming to a head. The July 20 plot, the attempt by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and other Wehrmacht officers to assassinate Hitler with a briefcase bomb placed in his conference room, failed when the Frere survived with only minor injuries. A heavy wooden table leg had shielded him from the worst of the blast. In the brutal purge that followed, thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed. The Gestapo's files grew thick with names extracted under torture, and Rommel's name began to appear with alarming frequency. Whether Rommel was an active conspirator remains debated by historians to this day. He certainly knew of the plot. Several conspirators had approached him, sounding him out. He certainly sympathized with its goals. He had told associates that Hitler must be removed from power to save Germany. But did he actively participate in planning the assassination? The evidence is ambiguous. What is clear is that he knew and did not report it, which in the paranoid worldview of Hitler's inner circle was enough. Suspicion was as good as a conviction. The fact that Rommel was beloved by the German people and respected even by the enemy made him not safer, but more dangerous to the regime. He was a man who could potentially lead a surrender or a separate peace, and Hitler could not allow that. This is the background of October 1944. One commander, Patton, frustrated by lack of fuel and the bureaucracy of high command, yet still at the head of a winning army that would eventually break through. And the other, Rommel, recovering from physical wounds only to find himself trapped in a political death spiral with no escape. Patton looked toward the Rhine, dreaming of being the first Allied general to cross it since Napoleon. Rommel looked toward his family, fearing every knock on the door, knowing that his time was running out. The first days of October 1944 brought a palpable sense of dread to both men, though for vastly different reasons. On one side, in the eastern regions of France, torrential autumn rains transformed the battlefield into an almost impassable swamp. Here, George S. Patton was fighting the slowest, most frustrating campaign of his entire career. On the other side, in the quiet German village of Herlingen, Erwin Rommel was fighting his last battle, not against an enemy he could see and engage, but against the treacherous regime he had once served with honor. For Patton, October was a month of mounting frustration that threatened to drive him to the breaking point. The U.S. Third Army, which had swept across France like a thunderbolt from the gods, was now stuck before the ancient fortifications of Metz, like an animal caught in quicksand. According to his diary entries, which he wrote religiously every night, he would stand at his headquarters window, watching the rain turn the road roads to rivers and curse everyone from Eisenhower to God himself. His anger wasn't directed solely at the enemy, but increasingly at his own high command. The fuel shortage that had halted his advance felt like a personal betrayal. "Give me the gas, and I'll end the war by Christmas," became his obsessive refrain at every meeting with supply officers and higher command. He believed it with every fiber of his being. In his mind, the pathway was clear. Drive hard to the Rhine, cross it before the Germans could establish new defensive lines, and then race for Berlin. The war could be over in months, but nobody was listening. Politics and logistics, his two greatest enemies, had conspired to halt him at the moment of his greatest momentum. Behind the ancient walls of Metz, the German First Army had constructed defensive positions that were textbook Rommel. The layered defense, the use of reverse slopes to hide positions, the careful integration of anti-tank guns with infantry strongpoints, the aggressive use of local counterattacks to keep the enemy off balance, all of it bore the fingerprints of the Desert Fox's tactical philosophy. Patton recognized it immediately. He ordered his officers to study Rommel's 1937 book Infantry Attacks and his tactical reports from North Africa. He would spend hours poring over maps and intelligence reports, trying to think like his absent adversary. "We're not here to die for our country," Patton would tell his men in his speeches, his voice rising to a near shout. "We're here to make the other poor bastard die for his country." It was vintage Patton. Profane, aggressive, unforgettable. But beneath the bravado, there was growing concern. His soldiers were exhausted. They had been fighting continuously since Normandy. The replacements arriving were young, poorly trained, often scared. And the weather was making everything worse. By October 10th, the casualty rate had climbed to alarming levels. Hundreds of soldiers were falling sick every day from trench foot, pneumonia, and dysentery, caused by the cold and wet conditions. The German MG-42 machine guns, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, cut down infantry attacks with devastating efficiency. Every bunker had to be taken with explosives and flamethrowers in close combat. Patton's dream of mobile warfare had devolved into something that looked disturbingly like World War I trench warfare. For a man who worshipped speed and movement, it was a nightmare. Patton's entire mental focus became obsessive: how to defeat Rommel's disciples, these German officers who had learned their craft from the master. He studied every defensive move, looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for some insight that would give him the edge. Even though Rommel himself was hundreds of miles away, his ghost haunted every pillbox, every minefield, every sudden counterattack that threw back an American advance. But while Patton was fighting mud and fortifications, Rommel was facing something far more terrifying: the methodical approach of his own death. Back in Herrlingen, the atmosphere in the Rommel household had become suffocating. The field marshal, still recovering from his July injuries, he suffered frequent headaches, and his left eye was damaged, could sense the noose tightening. The SS officers who stood guard outside his home were no longer even pretending to be there for his protection. They watched his every move. They noted every visitor. The surveillance was constant and obvious. After the July 20th assassination attempt failed, the Gestapo had unleashed a reign of terror across Germany that was extraordinary even by Nazi standards. Every day brought news of more arrests, more show trials, more executions. Rommel watched as his friends and fellow officers were dragged before the People's Court, a kangaroo court where the outcome was predetermined and the sentences were death. Some were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, deliberately, slowly, their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing pleasure. Others simply disappeared into the cellars of Gestapo headquarters, never to be seen again. The psychological tension in the Rommel household reached its breaking point on the evening of October 13th. An official message arrived. Two generals from Berlin would visit the next day to discuss Rommel's future assignments. The message was brief, formal, and carried an implicit threat that everyone understood. Rommel's wife Lucy and their 15-year-old son Manfred watched as the field marshal read the message, his face draining of color. "My time is up," he said quietly. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without drama. He had known this moment was coming. For weeks, he had watched the web closing around him. Friends had hinted that his name was appearing in confessions extracted under torture. Intelligence officers had warned him obliquely that Berlin was asking questions about his loyalty. He knew how the game would end. That night, the family sat together in the living room, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while knowing that their world was ending. Rommel played with the family dog. He talked with Manfred about school, about his future, about staying strong for his mother. Lucy tried to prepare dinner, but no one could eat. The tension was unbearable. Outside, the SS guards paced in the darkness. The village of Herrlingen, which had always loved its famous resident, seemed to hold its breath. Rommel knew what Hitler wanted, his death, but without the scandal of a trial. A trial would expose the regime's paranoia and weakness. It would reveal how far the rot had spread within the Wehrmacht's officer corps, and it would risk making Rommel a martyr, the beloved general murdered by the regime he had served. Hitler needed Rommel dead, but he also needed the German people to believe that their hero had died naturally, peacefully, still loyal to the fatherland. It was a final, grotesque charade, and Rommel would be forced to play his part. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the west, Patton remained completely unaware of the drama unfolding in Herrlingen. His intelligence reports indicated that the German high command was in turmoil, but he didn't know the specifics. He certainly didn't know that his magnificent bastard, the adversary he respected more than any other, was being measured for a coffin by his own government. On the night of October 13th, while Rommel sat with his family facing the approaching dawn of his execution, Patton was in his headquarters planning a new offensive. He had decided to bypass the strongest fortifications of Metz and strike at the city from unexpected angles. It was a risk, but Patton was always willing to gamble. He pored over maps late into the night, trying to find the weakness in the German defense, trying to think like Rommel would think. If I were defending this position, Patton said to his staff officers, pointing at the map, where would I expect the attack to come from? It was a question he asked constantly. By putting himself in Rommel's mind, he believed he could anticipate and counter the German tactics. He never knew that Rommel was no longer his adversary, that the Desert Fox's war was already over. The morning of October 14th dawned cold and foggy on both fronts. In Lorraine, Patton's artillery prepared for another day of bombardment. In Herrlingen, a black Mercedes appeared through the fog, carrying Rommel's executioners. October 14th, 1944, shortly before noon. Time seemed to stop in two different places, hundreds of miles apart, yet connected by an invisible thread of fate that neither man could see or understand. In Herrlingen, the black Mercedes pulled up to the Rommel home at precisely 11 a.m. German efficiency, even in murder, demanded punctuality. Inside the car sat General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief adjutant, and General Ernst Meisel. Both were fanatic loyalists, men who had proven their willingness to do the Führer's darkest bidding. They carried two items, a letter from Hitler outlining Rommel's crimes and offering him a choice, and a small wooden box containing a cyanide capsule. Rommel had been waiting, dressed in his old Afrika Korps leather jacket, the same jacket he'd worn through the desert campaigns that had made him famous. It was a deliberate choice, a statement. This is who I am. This is what I accomplished. This is how I will be remembered. He met the two generals at his door and showed them into his study, closing the door behind them. His wife and son waited in another room, hearts pounding, knowing but not wanting to know what was happening behind that door. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes. Burgdorf laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The Gestapo had evidence that Rommel was connected to the July 20th plot. Whether the evidence was real or fabricated didn't matter. Hitler had decided Rommel must die, but there was a choice. Rommel could face trial before the People's Court, where he would be publicly denounced as a traitor, found guilty in a predetermined verdict, and executed. His family would be arrested. His name would be erased from German military history, replaced with the label of traitor. His pension would be forfeit. His wife and son would likely end up in a concentration camp. Or, and here Burgdorf opened the small wooden box, Rommel could take the cyanide capsule. His death would be announced as the result of his July injuries, a delayed complication from his skull fractures. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His family would be safe, his pension preserved, his reputation intact. Germany would mourn its hero. The Desert Fox would die with his legend untarnished. It was a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, and everyone in the room knew it. Rommel looked at the capsule for a long moment. Did he think of the desert, where he'd fought with honor against enemies he respected? Did he think of his men, the soldiers who had followed him across North Africa and France? Did he think of his son, only 15 years old, whose future hung on his decision? I will never allow myself to be hanged by that man, Rommel said finally. It was the only defiance left to him. He would deny Hitler the spectacle of a trial. He would protect his family. He would control, in this one final way, how his story ended. Rommel emerged from the study and went to say goodbye to his wife and son. This is the part that breaks the heart of anyone who knows this story. He couldn't tell them explicitly what was about to happen. Burgdorf and Meisel were watching, but Lucy and Manfred understood. Rommel hugged his wife, holding her longer than usual. He put his hand on his son's shoulder and told him to be strong, to take care of his mother, to remember that he had always tried to do his duty. Then he walked out of his house, down the path he had walked 1,000 times before, and climbed into the back of the black Mercedes. Burgdorf and Meisel sat on either side of him. The car drove slowly through the village, slowly enough that several villagers saw it and waved, not knowing they were watching their hero's funeral procession. The car turned onto a quiet side road and stopped. What happened next took less than a minute. Rommel removed the cyanide capsule from its case. For a moment, he held it in his hand, this tiny thing that would end everything. All the battles, all the victories, all the glory, all the pain. Then, with the same calm he had shown 1,000 times in combat, he swallowed it. The poison worked fast. Cyanide disrupts the body's ability to use oxygen. Within seconds, Rommel's face contorted. He gasped, struggled for breath that wouldn't come, and slumped over. The greatest German general of World War II died in the back seat of a car on a quiet road, murdered by the regime he had served, denied even the dignity of dying in battle. Bergdorf and Maysel drove the body to a hospital in Ulm, where compliant doctors signed a death certificate listing the cause as cerebral embolism, a blood clot to the brain, a delayed complication of his July injuries. The lie was complete. The murder was done. At almost the exact moment Rommel died, hundreds of miles away in Lorraine, George Patton was experiencing his own crisis, not of death, but of purpose and progress. His headquarters at Nancy was a scene of controlled chaos. Officers rushed in and out with reports, none of them good. The assault on Fort Bryant had failed again. American casualties were mounting. The weather was worsening. And still, there was no breakthrough. Fort Bryant was a monster from a nightmare, one of the Metz fortifications that formed part of the larger Maginot Line complex. It had been built in the 1890s and modernized in the 1930s. Its walls were 20 feet thick in places. Its guns were housed in retractable steel cupolas that could survive direct artillery hits. It was connected by underground tunnels to other forts, so defenders could move without being seen. Engineers had tried to blast it open and gotten nowhere. Infantry had tried to storm it and been cut down. Flamethrowers had been used, explosives placed, tanks brought up to point-blank range. Nothing worked. For Patton, Fort Bryant represented everything he hated about modern war. It negated speed, negated mobility, negated aggression. It forced his army to fight the kind of grinding attritional battle that was anathema to his philosophy. He was being forced to fight like a World War I general, throwing men against fortifications in costly frontal assaults, when everything in his being screamed for movement and maneuver. I don't care about the goddamn mud. I don't care about the fuel shortage. I want that fort. He shouted at his generals, his face red with anger. But shouting couldn't change reality. His men were exhausted. The replacements were green and scared. The weather was getting worse by the day. And somewhere in his mind, he knew that the German defenders were fighting with a skill and determination that reminded him of North Africa, of Rommel's Afrika Korps, of an enemy that refused to quit no matter how hopeless the situation. Patton's mind kept returning to Kasserine Pass, the wound that had never quite healed. February 1943. His first encounter with Rommel's forces. The Americans, new to combat, poorly led, badly positioned, had been routed. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a humiliation. Tanks burning, soldiers running, entire units disintegrating. Rommel's panzers had torn through the American lines like they were made of paper. Nearly 200 Americans killed, thousands wounded or captured, equipment abandoned, chaos and panic. Patton had been brought in to rebuild the shattered units, to restore discipline and fighting spirit. He had done it through a combination of harsh discipline, insisting on proper uniform, proper salutes, proper military bearing, and aggressive training. He had turned defeat into eventual victory, but the memory of Kasserine haunted him. It was proof that Rommel, given even a slight advantage, could inflict devastating defeat on American forces. Now, stalled before Metz, Patton felt that same fear creeping back. What if he couldn't break through? What if his great advance ended here, in the mud? What if history remembered him not as the general who won the war, but as the general who was stopped at the German border? The thought was unbearable. In his diary that night, October 14, 1944, Patton wrote, "The war is ending, and I am stuck in the mud." He had no idea that on that same day, his greatest adversary had died. The news wouldn't reach Allied command for several days, and when it did, it would be reported as a natural death from injuries. Patton would never know the truth, never know that Rommel had been murdered by his own government. When Patton did hear the news, sometime around October 18th, his first reaction was a mixture of surprise and genuine sadness. He was the best they had, Patton told his staff officers. It was perhaps the highest compliment Patton could give. In his world, where professional competence was the highest virtue, Rommel had been a worthy opponent. Patton believed Rommel had died a soldier's death from wounds received in combat. He never knew about the cyanide capsule, the forced suicide, the state funeral built on lies. He never knew that while he fought to get back into the war, Rommel had been fighting to protect his family from his own government. The irony is profound. On October 14, 1944, both generals faced their defining crisis. One fought against military obstacles and lost, at least temporarily. The other faced political murder and won only in the sense that he died on his own terms and protected his family. One man's crisis was tactical, the other's was existential. One man had years left to live, the other had minutes. And neither knew anything about the other's struggle. The death of Erwin Erwin Rommel on October 14, 1944, marked more than just the end of one man's life. It represented a fundamental shift in the psychological warfare being waged alongside the physical combat, though the true circumstances of his death remained hidden from all but a few. The simple fact that the Desert Fox was gone rippled through both armies in ways that neither side fully anticipated. For the German forces, the loss was devastating. Even though most believed the official story of death from injuries, Rommel had been more than just a skilled tactician. He had been a symbol of German military excellence, proof that superior leadership and tactics could overcome material disadvantage. His victories in North Africa, achieved despite chronic shortages of fuel, ammunition, and supplies, had made him a legend. German soldiers believed that if Rommel was in command, they had a chance, no matter how dire the situation. With him gone, that psychological edge vanished. On the Western Front, German commanders who had studied under Rommel or absorbed his tactical philosophy found themselves rudderless. They continued to apply his defensive doctrines, the elastic defense, the sudden counterattack, the clever use of terrain, but without the genius who had created these tactics, without his ability to read a battlefield and exploit opportunities in real time. The methods became rote and predictable. It was like reading a great composer's sheet music without understanding the soul that had written it. Patton, meanwhile, was experiencing his own turning point, though it would take him several more weeks to fully recognize it. The news of Rommel's death, when it reached him around October 18th, hit him harder than he expected. He had never met Rommel, never faced him directly across a battlefield. Their paths had crossed only in the abstract, through the study of tactics and the respect one professional warrior has for another. Yet Patton felt a genuine sense of loss. "They've lost their best man," Patton told his staff. Then, after a pause, "Hell, we've lost one of the best opponents we could have faced." It was a strange thing to say in the middle of a war, but it revealed something essential about Patton's character. He didn't hate his enemies. He respected worthy adversaries. War, to Patton, was the ultimate test of a man's abilities, and a great opponent made victory more meaningful. But respect aside, Patton was a pragmatist. Rommel's death meant opportunity. Within days of receiving the news, Patton began to notice subtle changes in German defensive tactics. The counterattacks were becoming more predictable. The defensive positions, while still formidable, lacked the creative spark that had made Rommel's defenses so difficult to crack. It was as if the German commanders were following a textbook, Rommel's textbook, without understanding the thinking behind the tactics. Patton seized on this weakness. He ordered his intelligence officers to study recent German defensive patterns, looking for predictability. He noticed that counterattacks were now coming at expected times and from expected directions. German units were holding positions longer than they should, unwilling to execute the kind of tactical retreats that Rommel had used so effectively to preserve fighting strength while bleeding the enemy. On October 20th, Patton made a crucial decision. He would stop trying to batter through the strongest fortifications of Metz and instead use maneuver to isolate them. It was a quintessentially Patton solution. Avoid strength, exploit weakness, keep moving. He ordered the 4th Armored Division and the 6th Armored Division to swing wide around Metz's main defenses, cutting roads and rail lines, isolating the fortress city rather than assaulting it directly. It was, ironically, exactly the kind of tactic Rommel would have used if their positions had been reversed. Patton was applying lessons learned from studying his adversary, using Rommel's own philosophy against Rommel's disciples. "We're going to go around this goddamn fortress," Patton told his commanders. "Let them sit there and rot. We'll cut them off and move on to the next objective." The new strategy required one critical element that had been in short supply: fuel. But by late October, the supply situation was improving. The port of Antwerp was finally operational, dramatically shortening Allied supply lines. The Red Ball Express was running at full capacity. Patton's tanks could move again. On October 23rd, the Third Army launched its new offensive. Instead of a frontal assault on Metz's fortifications, American armor swept north and south of the city, cutting German supply lines and communications. The German defenders, following rigid defensive doctrines without Rommel's flexibility, found themselves trapped. They had been positioned to defend against direct assault, not to deal with a mobile force cutting off their rear areas. Within days, German units around Metz began to show signs of breaking. Some fell back without orders, trying to escape encirclement. Others surrendered when they realized they were cut off. The fortress that had held up Patton for nearly 2 months was being neutralized not by force, but by maneuver. By early November, Metz would fall, not because its fortifications had been breached, but because the garrison had been starved and isolated. The psychological impact of this success on Patton was profound. He had been stuck, frustrated, doubting himself for the first time since Normandy. Now he was moving again, doing what he did best. His confidence returned with a vengeance. In his diary he wrote, "We are going to end this war. war. Nothing can stop us now. But the turning point wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. Patton realized that he had been trying to fight Rommel's kind of war, the careful, methodical war of position and prepared defenses. What he needed to do was fight Patton's kind of war, aggressive, fast-moving, exploiting confusion and chaos. He had to stop being the student studying Rommel's textbook and start being Patton again. On the German side, the turning point was even more dramatic, though it manifested more slowly. Without Rommel, and with the true circumstances of his death still hidden, the German officer corps began to fracture. Some officers, particularly those who suspected the truth about Rommel's death, became openly defeatist. If the regime could murder its greatest general, what hope was there? Others doubled down on fanaticism, seeing any sign of doubt as treason. Hitler, meanwhile, was making increasingly erratic decisions. With Rommel gone, there was no one left in the German high command with the prestige and courage to question the Führer's strategic insanity. Rommel had occasionally pushed back against Hitler's no-retreat orders, arguing for tactical flexibility. Now, every German commander was expected to hold every position to the death, regardless of military logic. This inflexibility made German forces more predictable and easier to defeat. By the end of October 1944, the balance had shifted irreversibly. Patton's Third Army was on the move again, advancing toward the German border. The Wehrmacht, already outnumbered and outgunned, had lost its greatest tactical mind and was beginning to unravel from within. The turning point had been reached, but there's a deeper turning point that historians often overlook. October 1944 marked the end of an era. The kind of war that Rommel and Patton had mastered, the war of movement and maneuver, of individual genius and tactical brilliance, was giving way to something else entirely. The future belonged to industrial warfare, to atom bombs and guided missiles, to wars fought by technicians and scientists as much as by soldiers. Rommel and Patton were dinosaurs, magnificent dinosaurs, but dinosaurs nonetheless. They were the last generation of generals who could personally change the course of a battle through their presence on the battlefield. After them would come commanders who directed wars from bunkers hundreds of miles behind the lines, who moved divisions like chess pieces on a map, who never heard the sound of gunfire or smelled the smoke of battle. October 1944 was when the old world died and the new one was born. Rommel died literally, Patton's kind of warfare died metaphorically. The turning point wasn't just about one battle or one campaign. It was about the end of one kind of war and the beginning of another. In the blood-soaked landscape of World War II, where entire cities were incinerated from the air and millions died in industrial death camps, George Patton and Erwin Rommel stood out as anachronisms, warriors who tried to maintain codes of honor in an age that had abandoned honor entirely. Their legacy isn't just about tactics or victories, it's about the attempt, however imperfect, to fight a barbaric war without becoming barbarians themselves. Rommel's commitment to what he called Krieg ohne Hass, war without hate, was remarkable given the regime he served. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps had a reputation, even among Allied soldiers, for fighting cleanly. British and American prisoners of war captured by Rommel's forces were generally treated according to the Geneva Conventions. They received medical care, food, and water. Officers were allowed to keep their personal possessions. There were no mass executions, no deliberate atrocities. This was extraordinary in a war where such behavior was increasingly rare. When Hitler issued the infamous Commando Order in October 1942, directing that all captured Allied commandos be executed immediately, without trial, Rommel reportedly burned his copy of the order. He told his staff that soldiers captured in combat would be treated as prisoners of war, regardless of what Berlin said. It was an act of quiet defiance that could have cost him his command, or worse. But Rommel believed that there were lines that should not be crossed, even in war. This wasn't naive idealism. Rommel understood that the way you treat prisoners affects the way your own troops fight. If soldiers believe they'll be executed if captured, they fight more desperately, making them more dangerous. If they believe they'll be treated fairly, some may surrender when the situation is hopeless, saving lives on both sides. Rommel's chivalry was partially pragmatic, but it was also genuine, a reflection of his Prussian military upbringing, which emphasized honor and duty. The most striking example of Rommel's character came in his refusal to participate in the Holocaust. When the Nazi regime began implementing its genocidal policies in North Africa, ordering the roundup and deportation of Jewish populations in Tunisia and Libya, Rommel refused to cooperate. He told officials that his job was fighting the British, not persecuting civilians. He used the excuse of military necessity. He needed his troops fighting, not rounding up civilians, but the effect was the same. Under Rommel's command, the Wehrmacht in North Africa did not participate in the Holocaust. This stands in stark contrast to German forces on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was deeply complicit in mass murder. Rommel's Africa was not innocent. War is never innocent, but it was different. Allied soldiers who fought in North Africa and later in Europe would often comment on the difference. In Africa, you could respect your enemy. In Europe, especially after the concentration camps were discovered, that respect became impossible for most. Patton's chivalry took a different form, but was no less real. Despite his reputation for harsh discipline and profane speeches, Patton had a strict code about the treatment of civilians and prisoners. When the Third Army liberated French towns, Patton issued clear orders: no looting, no assaulting civilians, no retribution against Germans who surrendered. Violations were punished severely. Soldiers who raped or murdered civilians faced court-martial and execution. This wasn't universal in the Allied armies. As forces moved into Germany, there were incidents of looting and revenge attacks against German civilians. Patton worked hard to prevent this in his sector. He believed that American soldiers should behave as liberators, not conquerors. "We're not fighting to become like them," he told his officers. "We're fighting to prove we're better than them." Patton's respect for enemy soldiers was genuine, even though he hated the Nazi regime. He understood that most German soldiers were professionals doing their job, not ideological fanatics. When he toured a German military cemetery after a battle, he ordered his men to stand at attention and salute. "These were brave men," he said. "They fought for a bad cause, but they fought bravely. That deserves respect." This attitude was shared by both men in their approach to military leadership: lead from the front. In an age of industrial warfare, where generals typically commanded from headquarters miles behind the lines, both Rommel and Patton insisted on being where the fighting was. Rommel was famous for appearing at the front in his command vehicle, often ahead of his own troops, personally reconnoitering positions. He was nearly killed several times by enemy fire. On one occasion, his vehicle was hit by British artillery, and he was wounded by shrapnel. Patton was no different. He would drive to the front lines in his Jeep, standing upright despite sniper fire, visiting units in combat. His staff officers lived in constant fear that he would be killed. Patton's response was that soldiers fought better when they knew their general shared their danger. "You can't lead from behind a desk," he would say. "You have to be where you can smell the powder and hear the shells." This lead from the front mentality created fierce loyalty. Soldiers would follow these men into situations that seemed suicidal because they knew their commanders wouldn't ask them to go anywhere the commander wouldn't go himself. It was an old-fashioned concept, more appropriate to the age of Alexander the Great or Napoleon than to World War II, but it worked. The chivalry between Patton and Rommel extended to their respect for each other, even as enemies. Patton studied Rommel's tactics obsessively, reading his books, analyzing his campaigns, trying to understand how his mind worked. But it wasn't just clinical study. It was genuine admiration. Patton saw in Rommel a kindred spirit, a warrior who loved the fight for its own sake, who saw war as the ultimate test of skill and courage. When Patton heard of Rommel's death, still believing it was from combat injuries, he ordered that no celebration take place. Some of his staff were surprised. This was the enemy, after all. But Patton understood something that many didn't. The war was robbing the world of its finest military minds. Rommel's death made the victory easier, but it also made it less meaningful. You want to beat the best, not inherit victory because your opponent has been removed from the field. Would Rommel have felt the same about Patton? We can't know for certain. Rommel left no record of his opinion of Patton specifically, but we know he respected aggressive commanders. He would have recognized in Patton the same qualities he valued: boldness, speed, the willingness to take calculated risks. In another world, they might have been friends. This mutual respect was rare in World War II. Most commanders simply hated their enemies. The war on the Eastern Front, in particular, was fought with a viciousness that left no room for chivalry. But in the West, there were occasional moments of professional respect, and the Patton-Rommel relationship, even though it existed mostly in Patton's imagination, was the best example. The legacy of their chivalry matters because it shows that even in the worst circumstances, individuals can maintain their humanity. Neither man was perfect. Rommel served an evil regime, and Patton had his own significant character flaws, but both tried, in their own ways, to fight honorably. They believed that how you fight matters as much as whether you win. In the decades after the war, this legacy has been both celebrated and criticized. Some see Rommel and Patton as exemplars of military professionalism, men who proved that war doesn't have to destroy all decency. Others argue that the clean Wehrmacht myth, the idea that German forces fought honorably, is dangerous historical revisionism that ignores the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes. The truth is complex. Rommel's hands were not entirely clean. No one's hands in that war were clean. But he was genuinely different from many German commanders, and his reputation for honor was earned. Patton, similarly, was a deeply flawed man whose racism and ego caused caused real harm, but who genuinely tried to uphold certain standards of conduct in war. Their legacy of chivalry matters not because it erases the horrors of World War II, but because it shows that even in the darkest times, individuals can choose to be better than their circumstances demand. October 1944, when one man died and another fought on, represents a moment when that old code of warrior honor was passing from the world. We have not yet found anything adequate to replace it. The immediate aftermath of October 1944 set in motion a series of events that would define both men's legacies for generations to come. For Rommel, death meant mythology. For Patton, survival meant he would live long enough to tarnish his own legend and then die in a manner that would restore it. Rommel's state funeral took place on October 18, 1944, in Ulm. It was a grand affair, orchestrated by the Nazi propaganda machine to extract maximum benefit from the murder they had just committed. Hitler sent a massive wreath. The city was draped in black. Thousands of mourning Germans lined the streets. High-ranking Nazi officials gave speeches praising Rommel's loyalty and sacrifice. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Rommel's family, his wife Lucy and son Manfred, stood at the funeral knowing the truth but unable to speak it. They watched as the men who had murdered husband and father eulogized him as a hero. It must have been unbearable, but they maintained the lie, because that was the price of their survival. Manfred would not reveal the truth about his father's death until after the war, when he wrote a book exposing the forced suicide. The German people believed the official story. Their beloved Desert Fox had died from injuries received in combat. It was only after Germany's defeat, when Allied investigators began examining Nazi documents and interviewing survivors, that the truth emerged. The Gestapo files contained references to the Rommel problem and its solution. Bergdorf and Meisel's reports detailed the forced suicide. The lie unraveled, and with it came a strange redemption for Rommel's reputation. In the post-war period, Rommel became something unique, a good German general. While most Wehrmacht commanders were tainted by association with Nazi crimes, Rommel's record in North Africa, his refusal to participate in atrocities, his rumored connection to the resistance, and ultimately his murder by Hitler transformed him into an acceptable hero. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, needed a German general they could respect, and Rommel fit the bill. This created what historians call the Rommel myth, a perhaps overly sanitized version of the man that emphasizes his tactical brilliance and personal honor while downplaying his service to Hitler. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Rommel was a loyal German officer who served the Nazi regime, benefited from its conquests, and wore its decorations. But he was also a man who tried to fight honorably, who grew disillusioned with Hitler, and who ultimately paid for that disillusionment with his life. The Desert Fox became a symbol of the Wehrmacht that could have been professional, competent, honorable. Whether that Wehrmacht ever really existed is debatable, but Rommel's legend served a purpose. It allowed Germans to take pride in their military tradition while distancing themselves from Nazi crimes. It allowed former enemies to reconcile. British Field Marshal Montgomery, Rommel's old adversary, wrote respectfully of him in his memoirs. Rommel became the enemy it was okay to have admired. Patton's aftermath was very different. October 1944 was not his end, but his second wind. After finally breaking through at Metz in November, he drove hard toward the German border. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes in December, the Battle of the Bulge, Patton performed what many consider his greatest feat. He turned his entire Third Army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and attacked north into the German flank, relieving the besieged town of Bastogne. It was a logistical miracle that probably no other commander could have achieved. By the end of the war, Patton was at the height of his fame. He had led the Third Army across France, through Germany, and into Czechoslovakia. He was everywhere. Newspapers, newsreels, magazine covers. He was the face of American victory, the general who had proven that aggressive American warfare could defeat German military professionalism. But peacetime would not be kind to Patton. His Cold War rhetoric, immediately calling for war against the Soviet Union, alarmed politicians. His comments about Nazi party members, suggesting that the occupation government needed to use some former Nazis who had administrative experience, sparked outrage. His inability to adapt to peacetime sensibilities made him a liability. Eisenhower, now military governor of the American occupation zone, removed Patton from command of the Third Army and gave him a ceremonial position. Patton was miserable. He was a warrior without a war, increasingly marginalized and irrelevant. In his diary, he wrote bitterly about politicians and bureaucrats who didn't understand that the real threat now came from Stalin, not from defeated Germany. He gave ill-advised interviews where he said things that would haunt his reputation. He seemed to be doing his best to destroy his own legacy. Then, on December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car car was involved in a collision with an American military truck near Mannheim, Germany. Patton suffered a severe spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered for 12 days in a hospital bed, fully conscious, knowing he was dying. On December 21, 1945, he finally succumbed to a pulmonary embolism. The manner of Patton's death, injured not in combat but in a traffic accident, dying slowly in a hospital bed, seemed almost cruel for a man who had so desperately wanted to die in battle. He had often said that the best death for a soldier was to be killed by the last bullet in the last battle of the war. Instead, he died months after the fighting ended, in an accident, never having achieved his dream of leading American forces against the Soviets. But the manner of his death also restored his legend. It removed him from the post-war controversies before they could fully damage his reputation. He died before his Cold War hawkishness could be proven right or wrong. He died before his views on race and politics could be further exposed and condemned. He died a martyr to peace, a warrior who couldn't survive in a world without war. It was almost poetic. Patton was buried in the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of his Third Army. His grave is marked by a simple white cross, identical to those of the men who served under him, though positioned slightly ahead of the others, leading from the front even in death. To this day, his grave is one of the most visited in the cemetery, covered with flowers, coins, and notes from visitors who still admire the man. The legacy of both men has been shaped heavily by popular culture. The 1970 film Patton, starring George C. Scott, cemented Patton's image in the American imagination. Brilliant, profane, eccentric, uncompromising. The famous line, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book," became part of American popular culture, even though Patton never actually said it. The film won 7 Academy Awards and turned Patton into an icon. Rommel has been the subject of numerous films and books, usually portrayed sympathetically as the good German general. The 1951 film The Desert Fox with James Mason presented Rommel as a tragic hero. More recent works have tried to present a more nuanced view, acknowledging both his tactical genius and his service to an evil regime. But the fundamental image remains: Rommel as the honorable enemy. In military academies around the world, both men are still studied. Their campaigns are analyzed for lessons in leadership, tactics, and operational art. The Israel Defense Fund has studied Rommel's desert tactics extensively. The U.S. Army still teaches Patton's principles of aggressive warfare and leadership. Military professionals recognize that both men were products of their time and had significant flaws, but also that they were genuinely brilliant at their craft. The October 1944 connection between them, Rommel's death occurring just as Patton was experiencing his crisis at Metz, has become a symbol of a larger truth. They were two sides of the same coin, warriors whose paths were always destined to intersect, even though they never met. They represented the end of one kind of warfare and the beginning of another. They were the last of the great captains, generals who could change the course of battles through personal leadership and tactical genius. In the decades since their deaths, the world has moved on. Modern warfare is fought with drones and satellites, with cyber weapons and precision-guided munitions. The kind of war that Patton and Rommel mastered, where a general's personal courage and tactical insight could turn defeat into victory, is gone, probably forever. We will not see their like again. Yet their legacies endure, not just in military textbooks, but in our imagination. They represent something we've lost. The idea that war, however horrible, could still be a test of individual excellence, that warriors could be honorable even in the midst of barbarism, that courage and skill still mattered in an age of industrial slaughter. Whether that idea was ever truly real, or just a myth we need to believe, is perhaps beside the point. October 1944 was when those two paths finally diverged, one toward death and mythology, the other toward final victory and a different kind of immortality. But in our collective memory, Patton and Rommel remain forever linked, the magnificent bastards who defined what it meant to be a warrior in the last war where warriors still mattered. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War, though perhaps one of the most compelling. The lives of George Patton and Erwin Rommel were bound by more than just combat. They were bound by the very essence of what it meant to lead in the face of absolute destruction. From the mud of Metz to the quiet sacrifice in Herlingen, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Luxembourg, their names remind us that even in the darkest hours of human history, individual courage and character still matter. October 1944 was a month that changed everything and nothing. It changed nothing because the war's outcome was already determined. Germany would lose, the Allies would win. The industrial might of America and the Soviet Union would overwhelm Nazi Germany no matter what any individual general did or didn't do. But it changed everything because it marked the end end of an era, the passing of a certain kind of warrior, and the transformation of war itself from a test of individual excellence into a contest of industrial production and technological supremacy. We study these men not to glorify war is horror and tragedy, but to understand something about leadership, about courage, about maintaining one's humanity in inhumane circumstances. Patton and Rommel were deeply flawed human beings. They served causes that were, to different degrees, tainted by evil. They made mistakes that cost lives. They held views that we now find abhorrent, but they also showed qualities, tactical brilliance, personal courage, professional honor that deserve to be studied and, yes, admired. As we've journeyed through this month, we've seen two men at their respective crossroads, one facing political murder by his own regime, the other facing professional frustration and military stalemate. We've seen how their paths, which seemed destined to intersect on the battlefield, instead crossed in the realm of mythology and legacy. We've seen the last gasp of an older form of warfare, where individual generals could still change the course of history through personal genius and leadership. The thunder of their tanks has long since faded. The battlefields of Lorraine are now peaceful farmland. The fortress of Metz is a tourist attraction. Herrlingen is a quiet village where few remember the drama that played out there in October 1944. But the echo of that thunder still resonates. It reminds us that history is made by individuals, that choices matter, and that how we face our darkest moments defines us forever. Subscribe to We Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Join us in our next deep dive into the moments that defined the 20th century. Until then, remember the lessons of the past, for they are the maps of our future. Remember that even in the midst of total war, individuals can choose to maintain their honor. Remember Patton and Rommel, not as paragons of virtue, but as deeply human warriors who remind us that character matters, even in the crucible of history's greatest conflict. The duel that never was remains one of history's most compelling what-ifs, but perhaps it's better this way, better to remember them as they were, each at the peak of his powers, than to imagine some climactic battlefield confrontation that would have diminished them both. In our imagination, they remain forever locked in combat, the magnificent bastards who defined an era and embodied a code of honor that the world desperately needs to remember.